We will start with a talk on global farm animal welfare opportunities by Bollard. Bollard leads the Open Philanthropy Project strategy for farm animal welfare. Hold it. That was really appropriately enthusiastic. Prior to joining Open Philanthropy, Lewis worked as a policy advisor and international liaison to the CEO at the Humane Society of the US, HSUS. He has a BA from Harvard University in social studies and a JD from Yale Law School. Please welcome Lewis.
Cool. Thank you, Ajaya. Let's see if, oh nice, cool, the big pig. Welcome all, thanks for coming out to hear about farm animals. I think I know most of you already, but if any of you want to say hi later on, feel free to come by and say hi. Not going to spend a lot of time on convincing you to care about animals, but more talking about some of the things we're supporting and why, but more importantly, some of the things you could support and some of the things we could think about for the future. So, this is just a quick rundown of what we funded to date at the Open Philanthropy Project. My hope is that this is about to increase by about $10 million in the next week. We'll make another set of grants, I hope. But what you can kind of see here is we have supported a lot of corporate campaigns, a lot of work focused on reforming the worst practices in the layer hen industry and the broiler chicken industry. We've also supported work on fish welfare, on China and India, and then a number of other things like the Good Food Institute falls under the general operating support category there, animal charity evaluators, some other similar groups. About 60% of the grants to date have been international, and that's what I'll be explaining why today. So why fund globally? This, by the way, is a cow that I met in India. Most of these photos are from photos that I took myself, which I apologize in advance. Also going to be talking about the current opportunities, some of the things we're funding, and future opportunities, things that could be funded in the future. So why global? So this is really the only animal cruelty shot that I've included here. We're familiar to most of you. This is an image of a battery cage at a farm that we visited in Andhra Pradesh in India. And our best guesstimate is that about 80% of hens globally are in battery cages, very similar to this. So if you went into a facility in the US, it would look a little different. There'd be an automated egg layer belt rather than the individual pickup of eggs that was going on here. But otherwise, it would be basically the same as this. And from a hen's perspective, it's the same whether you're confined in a cage in India, in the US, in China, or anywhere. And so the basic case for focusing on a global approach then is that these hens are experiencing the same kind of suffering no matter where they are. This really breaks down the numbers by category of animals. So what you see is if you look first at broiler chickens, of which there are about 23 billion, that's live animal numbers. So you might have heard sometimes that 60 billion chickens are slaughtered a year globally. This is the number that are just alive at any point in time. So if we think we're most concerned about the experience of animals at any point in time, this gives you a sense of just how many animals are on predominantly factory farms. Not all factory farmed, but predominantly factory farmed right now. And what probably immediately stands out to you within each of these categories is that the United States, although significant, is very much in the minority of the number of animals being confined globally. Particularly when you look at the category of farmed fish at the end, and you see there's kind of a broad range there. That's our best estimate is 35 to 120 billion, a very broad range because we really don't know how many farmed fish there are. You see a tiny fraction of those animals are in the US. And it's not really the case, as the next slide will show, it's not really the case that this is US consumption coming from other countries. The trade in global animal products isn't huge. What's primarily going on here, for instance, with the huge bars that are China, is domestic consumption within China. So if we don't address China, if we don't address India, if we don't address other parts of Asia, then we're really not going to deal with the bulk of animal suffering globally. So, courtesy of ProVeg, Sebastian, their representative, is in the audience today. This cool slide breaks down by countries the amount of meat consumed. So the color is the amount of meat consumed per capita, and the size is the total amount of meat consumed. And again, what you see here is the United States is big. It's certainly eating more meat than our geography would suggest it should. But there are other parts of the world that are really big too. Obviously, Europe and China are well outsized compared to their geography. And the trend lines aren't great either. So if you look at China, obviously the chickens line really stands out here, but even if you look at the ducks or the pigs, you see a pretty fast growth rate in the scheme of things, 2, 3, 4 times higher than the level of those farm animals was just 40, 50 years ago, where the Chinese population has not increased by anywhere near that much. And then obviously if you look at chickens, you just see a phenomenal growth rate in terms of the number of chickens being farmed in China. This is something you're seeing across a number of countries, particularly in East Asia. And this gives you a little breakdown of, from a reform perspective or legal protection perspective, where we're at. There are very basic legal protections in place for farm animals, if they are in place at all globally. So the red countries on here have no farm animal welfare laws whatsoever on the books. The yellow countries have some form of law on the book that could be applicable, but that is either not being enforced or is very weak. And if you're familiar with the US legal framework for farm animals, you'll know there are only 2 federal laws. Only one of them is enforced, and that one only applies to mammals at slaughter. And it's a very small portion of countries that have what I've here called strong, although I think most people would dispute that these are strong farm animal laws. They're only strong relative to the total lack of legislation in the rest of the world. So, current opportunities. What can we do right now to address farm animal suffering? And given this is a relatively short amount of time and I want to leave more time for questions and discussion and engagement, I'm just going to talk about 2 things that we've focused a lot of resources on within this space, and then talk about a couple of other future opportunities. So the first one is Cagefree campaigns and corporate campaigns. And in the audience today, we have Aaron Ross and David Coman-Heidi, who have been at the center of these campaigns for the Humane League and the Open Wing Alliance. These are campaigns that have gone after companies to really get them to reform the conditions in which their animals are kept and to get rid of some of the worst practices within factory farming. And for those of you familiar with battery cages, a particularly horrific practice, something where corporate pledges have the capacity to really phase that out and to relieve some of the suffering these animals experience. So what you see here is just a kind of quick rundown of what that looks like for the animals. This is a photo on the left that I took at a factory farm in India. And on the right, this is a cage-free photo from a major industrial cage-free facility. It's still not a great life for hens. There are too many hens in there. There are all sorts of problems they have. I do think it's a meaningful improvement, and we're going to have a report on this soon that will break down whether I'm right about that or not. So this is a campaign that was put up by Animal Equality in Mexico, campaigning against Soriana. This is an example of globalizing these campaigns. So first in 2015 and then into early 2016, these campaigns had huge success in the US, getting the largest US supermarkets, fast food companies, other food companies to phase out battery cages. Those campaigns have now gone global, focused here on Latin America, but also focused, in this case, another animal equality protest in Spain, in this case, focused in the European Union as well, to get as many global food companies as possible to commit to phasing out these cages so that we can ultimately eliminate battery cages globally. The second major focus of current opportunities I'd like to raise is China. And what you see here is a survey that was done 3 years ago. It's not a totally representative survey. This was based on a university sending students home with questionnaires to their parents. But those students went home across 26 different regions across China, and they put various checks in place, and it was a sample of 6,000. So it's really the best data we have on what the average Chinese citizen feels about farm animal welfare. And I think this is generally something to be pretty optimistic about. So there were some things in the survey where a lot of people didn't understand the concept of animal welfare, weren't familiar with it. But what you see here is when they asked specific questions about specific practices, they said, do you think that rearing pigs on cement floors, which is absolutely standard practice across the pork industry, not just in China, but in the US, do you think that's acceptable? The majority of Chinese respondents to the survey said no. They said, is it okay to kill fowl or chicken in front of cages where other chickens are kept? And if you've ever been to a live animal market in India or somewhere else in the developing world, realize this is totally standard. Again, this was something that most people thought was unacceptable. And most people were in favor of passing a general animal welfare law, which is something that China still doesn't have, but hopefully will in the next few years. So these are a couple of things we've supported in China. We've taken two approaches there. The first is building capacity within the government. So there are a number of people within the government, the Ministry of Agriculture, the Chinese Veterinary Medical Association, who are interested in addressing some of the worst practices in China. And so a lot of what these grants seek to do is to empower those parts of the government to provide them with the kind of technical help they need to get up to world-class standards in animal welfare and to slowly create change through that institutional system. The other approach we've taken is supporting meat reduction efforts within the country. So this is a Wild Aid campaign poster, 6 Chinese celebrities who each of them in this poster is endorsing the message of eating less meat. And the campaign is really focused around environmental concerns, but deliberately focusing on less meat of all varieties. So not just less red meat, but less meat so that China's really fast-growing meat trajectory can hopefully come down over time. Future opportunities. So you're probably thinking this isn't a farm animal, but actually it is a farm animal. This dog was previously a farmed meat dog, and that's of course a pig. So fish, what can we do to help fish? And this graph really kind of illustrates what's been going on. You see that since 1985, the volume, because we don't get actual numbers in the statistics, but the volume of fish brought in, wild caught, hasn't increased. And that's really a factor of how efficiently commercial fishermen have depleted the world's oceans, that it's really impossible for them to bring in more fish now. They're doing more and more work every year just to get the same amount of fish. But because the demand for fish has increased dramatically over the same time period, there's been a huge growth in farmed fish. And at this point, it seems like for human consumption, there's actually more farmed than wild. The reason why wild still looks bigger here is that this includes wild fish caught to feed to farmed fish and wild caught fish caught to feed to other farm animals. Something else we need to do is help build the movement globally. So this is a small Taiwanese group having a protest in Taipei and thinking about where there are these groups that we're really not connected with currently, whether they're in Taiwan, whether they're in Indonesia, in China, in Japan, in Korea, across these countries that have large numbers of farm animals and have seen very little activism to date. And this is something where I want to focus more at the Open Philanthropy Project is how we can reach these groups, provide them with support, and empower them to grow. And then there's the technological solutions. And so this is the Impossible Foods burger, many of you may be familiar with, and thinking about how can we help these technologies to expand beyond where they are right now. The Impossible Foods company just got a $75 million investment infusion, both from the Open Philanthropy Project, Bill Gates, and a number of other investors. We're seeing a number of companies within this space doing some really impressive work in terms of developing clean meat, clean animal products, plant-based meats, and I think there's a huge amount of room to grow in that space. So with that, I'd like to open up to a discussion. I think given most of you are already pretty familiar with animal issues, I think it'll probably be more useful to kind of see what's on your mind, what you think the future opportunities are, and what you'd be interested in discussing or disagreeing with me about. Thanks. Ari.
Why do you think that there isn't the existence of animal rights groups in these other parts of the world? Is it just that it's the activity of activism is less common? Is it more that it's not supported? Is it that people just cultures don't support caring for animals as much? What is the underlying current that's prevented them from having this in existence already?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So if anyone didn't hear it or on the video, it's asking why in many parts of the world there isn't yet an organized animal rights movement. I think this would be a great topic for someone to do a PhD dissertation on or a major research paper. I think that there are some explanations out there, but they're far from satisfying. So, people often give cultural explanations, say, well, in Britain, the animal welfare movement started in the 1830s, and a lot of the US movement came over from Britain. But if you read some really good articles that have been written on Wikipedia recently, actually have been commissioned and written on Wikipedia about the history of animal rights movements in other countries, you'll see that in 16th century Japan, there was a lot of concern about animal rights and animal welfare. And it's similar at other points in the history of India or of Indonesia and other countries. So I think that saying it's just a cultural thing is kind of an easy get out. I think that we haven't done much organizing. We haven't really tried in a lot of these places, and there hasn't been the funding that there's been in the US. I think the funding situation for farm animal groups and activists is far better in the US than it is in other parts of the world. But I would love to see more research on what caused that, and more importantly, how we can rectify that. Yeah, the back.
When you try to engage governments or organizations, do you find that they're generally already interested in just trying to find a way how to do it, or do you need to persuade them to do something in this area? And if you need to persuade them, what arguments do they generally respond most to? Is it kind of the health? Is it the animals? Is it the environment? What do you find works best for those conversations?
Sure. So question about the receptiveness of governments and what messages work best for them. I think that most governments are not very receptive to working on either reforming the conditions of farm animals or reducing total meat consumption. I think that has a lot to do with the power of farmers and agriculture as a lobby group in most of the world, and has a lot to do with the fact that we haven't yet, as an animal movement or as EAs or as other people concerned about animal welfare, really mobilized in the same way as farmers have. But I do think that there is an increasing receptivity to it. I think within Europe, there's been a lot more concern for a far longer period of time, both about farm animal welfare, but also about the environmental and health costs of high meat consumption levels. And so it seems like governments are more receptive to that. I think that in places like China, we're seeing the government becoming increasingly open to the idea that it's simply not sustainable for their population to continue eating more meat at the level it is currently, and that with a population that will be rapidly aging because of the one-child policy, they have real health concerns about the kind of chronic diseases that high meat consumption could bring about. So I think that there are messages that work, and I think, for instance, in India, there's long been a government receptiveness to animal welfare. Animal welfare is enshrined in the Constitution. There's a law passed in 1947, right after independence, putting down pretty strict standards in terms of animal cruelty. It's not well enforced. So I think that in a lot of the world, there is that receptivity, and probably more so than at the US government, where the agricultural lobby has such power. I think in a lot of other countries, we're getting to a point where there really is the potential to bring about meaningful changes through the legislative process. Yeah.
So just to kind of follow up on that, I am curious about the animal welfare and getting it in education systems, because it's a supply and demand type relationship, and as consumers, we're so far removed from, we're eating pork, we're eating bacon, we're not eating pig, and they have the virtual reality of it, that's kind of very eye-opening to the issues at hand. So, there's demographics and there's government pressure they can put on, but what about just proactively, engaging students and, the newer generation and into what animal welfare is and, going on with that. So do you have any rapports going on with that?
Sure, yeah, so the question was about education and how we can reach more young people with animal welfare messages. I think this is really important. I think the big question is always about scalability and how you can make programs that scale across a large population. I think there's some really interesting work going on in China right now with a group called Act for Asia Animals. They are working in schools to develop curriculums that encourage both more concern for animals and more concern for humans. A lot of the programs in the US of the sort of humane education variety at the primary school level traditionally were quite local and weren't able to achieve a lot of scale. I think that's one reason why groups often focused at universities, which tend to be larger and where they can reach more people more easily. But I think it's a great challenge to think about how we can reach more students, whether it's through websites, whether it's through apps, whatever the platform is to reach more people and get that scale. Bruce.
How are you thinking about effective advocacy with the organizations that you're funding in parts of the world where maybe the organizations have been underfunded? Like the photo that you put up of Taiwan, and the demonstration that they were doing looked like the sort of demonstration you wouldn't fund, like a group that primarily did that, you wouldn't probably fund in the United States or most other places. Like, and it's been my impression that OPP like picks the things that you think are working and funds them, but then doesn't really sort of dictate how that's done. Do you feel that way about these sorts of groups, or do you also give them some sort of efficacy guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so it's a question about groups in other parts of the world where they may not have developed particularly effective tactics yet. And Bruce Friedrich, for those who don't know, is the head of the Good Food Institute, was previously at PETA, where I imagine you dressed up in chicken costumes at various times. I suspect that that in a lot of cases there's kind of a natural learning curve here, that it is useful to have groups organically testing what works in that environment. And as much as it might well be the case that those Taiwanese activists have not yet worked out how to be really effective, they almost certainly know more about being effective animal activists in Taiwan than I do. And so I think that as a funder, we try to be humble on that side. We're not necessarily humble in terms of aggressively seeking out funding opportunities and trying to find what we think will be the most effective funding opportunities. But I think we probably right now have more to offer in terms of financial resources than we do in terms of coaching or mentoring or other things, particularly given how different these environments tend to be if we're looking to fund globally. Yes?
First of all, it's a farm cat, and but more importantly, how do you think about population ethics of animals that wouldn't have existed otherwise, like the farm fish example?
So this is a free-range cat. I think that's a really interesting question in terms of the ethics of animals that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And as you say, it becomes particularly stark in the case of wild-caught fish. There are certainly those who believe that wild-caught fish's lives are, net positive, good lives to have, and that might even outweigh the pain of being caught at the end of the life. That wouldn't mean you would think it's like the best solution for them to be caught at the end of their life. And I suspect that as horrible as it probably is to be swallowed by a whale, it may be better than being dragged along behind a trawling vessel for hours and slowly suffocated. So I think in the current setup, it's quite likely that the alternative for these animals, as bleak as it is, may be less bad. But that certainly is something worth researching further. And the other thing I would say, for those who aren't just promoting veganism or meat reduction, but are also promoting welfare reforms, you don't need to have a view on whether something's net positive or not to believe that we should mitigate the harm and reduce the suffering. So even just moving away from trawling nets or long line fishing, where a fish can be stuck on these lines or in these nets for hours, slowly suffocating, slowly dying, toward methods that are far quicker, which, while not super exciting and appealing as a campaign slogan, I think could do a huge amount to alleviate suffering.
We already heard a lot about clean meat and how tech can really help the cause forward. I mean, what would you say to the argument, okay, if this is going to come, this is going to solve the problem anyway, so to what extent do you think the other groups who do other kinds of drugs still actually have an important role to play?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think that sometimes at conferences like these, we tend to kind of become tech utopians who assume that technology will solve everything, and I hope it will. But I do think that it's really useful to have a diversity of approaches, both because tech might not solve everything, but also because tech doesn't operate in a vacuum. People only want to fund clean meat research, only want to get involved in clean meat research, and will only want to buy clean meat if they've first been motivated to at least be concerned about the amount of meat that's being eaten globally and how that meat is produced. Thank you. Yeah.
So, in a couple of the countries that you mentioned as areas with really great opportunities for animal welfare work, I think one of the major barriers is regulation and corruption in those areas. Is that something that OPP is looking at all in terms of ways to address that with regards to animal welfare work?
Yeah, definitely. So the question about corruption in developing countries, I think in particular emerging markets where there are major farm animal issues. So this is something we dealt a lot with our grants we recently recommended in India. One of the major problems there, as I mentioned, they have quite strong legal protections on the book. So far stronger than US federal protections for farm animals. But those protections are almost uniformly unenforced. And so a lot of the focus has been about how do we get them enforced. And sometimes it's just because people don't even know they're on the law books or don't care about them, but oftentimes it's because there's some corruption going on, or the local chicken market is paying off the local officials. And talking with a lot of the activists there who have been involved in the ground for a long time, what they have found most effective has been to engage at the community level with those officials enforcing the laws and the directives. And obviously, one person or one group can't do that, but there's been a lot of effort to go around the country to meet with groups, to empower grassroots groups, to train local policemen and prosecutors, to train other officials, and to really get that local buy-in. And what they've found, or say they found, is that typically if someone in the community goes to the local official and starts telling other people, hey, this law isn't being enforced, it's far harder for that official to just completely ignore it if the whole community is talking about it. It's a lot easier if the government in Delhi is just saying, hey, do this, and not really following up on it. So I think compliance is a huge issue here. It's easy to say, hey, we got a law on the book. I mean, the same way as with a corporate pledge. We got a corporate pledge on the book, but it's a whole other thing to make sure it actually results in tangible changes for animals. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the documentary What the Health and the effectiveness of this in the documentary?
The question was about What the Health, and thankfully I haven't seen What the Health, so I can dodge that question. Yeah.
You, in an EA talk that I heard you give previously, you were talking about the percentage of people who believe in farm animal welfare, but sort of contrasted with the intensity of their belief in animal welfare. And I think comparing it to like the anti-abortion movement or the Second Amendment movement, and you had some sort of interesting reflections on that. I'm wondering if you would mind reprising briefly what you said and reflecting on the degree to which that does or doesn't influence OPP's strategic thinking.
Yeah, so a question about the salience of animal welfare issues for people. And I think there's this really interesting conundrum where we've had polls for years in the United States saying 95% of Americans support protections for farm animals, 80% support stronger laws for farm animals, 80% think gestation crates are unacceptable, and yet we don't see any legal change, at least at the federal level. We've seen some at the state level resulting from this, but we typically don't see legislators highly responsive to these concerns. And one possible reason is just because some of the legislatures are a little corrupt and they're heavily paid by agribusiness and so on. But I don't think that's a complete explanation. I think that when you look at the polling data, one of the things that really breaks down is that when you ask people, well, how do you think farm animals are doing currently? And most of them give a kind of response. Like they're like, it seems like they're doing all right, or I don't know. There aren't a lot of people who are really actively aware of how farm animals are doing. Similarly, when you ask a survey question, what do you think the average American feels about protections for farm animals? And all of a sudden, everyone who said, I'm really concerned about farm animals, say they think the average American is not very concerned about farm animals. Or you do a willingness to pay survey and say, how much more would you pay? And they say, I'd pay $3, $4, or $5 more for higher welfare foods. And then you look what happens in the supermarket, and of course, they don't. So I think there's a real salience problem there. In terms of how we address that, I think that is a great question for advocacy groups to be thinking about. A couple of ideas. I think that repeated contacts in terms of more investigations, more ads, more times when people interact with this message, engage with this message. I think reaching influential celebrities, politicians, business leaders, other people who can engage with that debate. And I think technology will help with that, because I think it will ultimately, whether it's the VR headsets out here, it will provide more engaging ways for people to interact with this issue and to really engage with the issue. And I think we're out of time, so thank you so much for coming out, and I hope you had a great conference. You have a great week.